Hi, I'm Dan. Thanks for tuning in again in the second of what I expect to be a series of short videos regarding topics that come up a lot in my D&D life. The first one was over style of play, and at the conclusion of that, I gave my advocacy for collaborative story building as the preferred style of play that I hope that everyone aspires to. And that sort of leads directly into another topic that comes up when people are challenged with the difficulty of it, and that is using battle maps versus theater of the mind. And it may not seem to be a related topic, but it really is. So what happens is if one is working towards a collaborative story building style, right? If one is the story is flowing along, the DM is and the players are integrated in creating that story. The players describe what the PCs are doing. The DM describes the reaction of the environment and non-player characters. And then you reach a point where the action is accelerated, right? Something big happens, and the immediate sequence of events becomes important, right? It's like, I need to know, the DM needs to know who's doing what and how those, in the order in which they are resolved. And at that point, we see a lot of DMs transition to a battle map, right? So if one looks at, like in recent games, there have been, curiously, several different avalanches occurred. And in some of those, the DMs has transitioned to a battle map, and it would be something like, the DM would put the tokens or miniatures on a battle map, and they say, okay, there's an avalanche coming in this direction. Let's go into initiative. And then the avalanche would have an initiative of its own, and then the players would say, okay, I'm gonna move my token here and do this, and then on the avalanche's turn, certain effects would be applied, damage or effects would occur, and that might go on for 4 turns, 5 turns, something like that. Then the avalanche is done. Now, in others, the DM would simply say, okay, you're moving along in something of a group. Suddenly from the northwest, you hear a calamitous sound. You look up, see a wall of ice, snow, and debris rushing at you. You have only seconds to react before that reaches you. And so tell me what you're going to do in those few seconds. And a player would say, "Oh, I'm gonna try to get under some cover." And the DM would say, "Okay, give me a dexterity saving throw to try and get underneath that, to try and get under enough cover to protect you from the avalanche." Or a player might say, "Well, I'm going to try to grab the livestock and drag them behind the wagon." So and the DM would say, "Okay, make me a animal handling check to see how effective you are at that." So in the one situation, right, with using the battle maps, the story flow is interrupted. It transitions to a board game, right, with tokens being moved around or miniatures being moved around, and then game turn effects being applied. And I understand how, if you are not accustomed to using description and imagination, that is easier to do, right? That is easier to visualize, because you can actually look down there at the board and say, okay, I can see what's happening. But it doesn't change the fact that you are transitioning out of your storytelling and into a board game, which interrupts the narrative significantly. This is also true when it comes to combat. So the party's moving along and suddenly some bugbears attack, and so the DM can put the tokens on there and put down, say, okay, we need to go into initiative, and then each player takes a turn, including the bugbears, and the bugbears on their turn move out and attack and move back and whatever. Or the DM can say, you're moving along, and suddenly, about 30 feet away, a group of bugbears jump out from behind rubble and attack you. Let's go into initiative, right? And then there's no specificity of positioning at that point, except that you're about here, they're about there. And what the challenge becomes is very often is you have players who are not used to that, right? You have players who, for the past 20 years have been seeing miniatures on a battle map or tokens in the case of online play, and they want to know that specificity, right? They're not happy with about 30 feet away. They're like, well, I need to know, is that bugbear 30 feet away, 25 feet away, or 35 feet away, right? And DMs are like, no, I'm not going to. So what happens is DMs then try to say, okay, it is exactly, there's 125, there's 130, and there's 135. And then the player says, okay, I'm going to move exactly 15 feet to the northwest and do this, right? And so the DM needs to avoid that level of specificity. The DM just says, no, they're about to move away. What are you going to do? Right? If you're not going to do something, then you're going to dodge. But I'm telling you, they're about to move away, right? So there are several things at play here. First of all, right, the idea of a individual being able to look at a situation or look at an opponent and know precisely, oh, I recognize that opponent is exactly 30 feet away and not 33 feet away, which they then round up to 35, right? That is just not realistic, right? That doesn't reflect the reality of the combat. But more importantly, it's not necessary, right? Just describe what your character is going to do. The player describes what the character is going to do, right? If you're going to make an attack, if you're going to hide, just like so. So, like, for example, in the case of rogues, what you find with a lot of players who they want to be able to look at the battle map and say, oh, I see some cover right there. So I'm going to precisely do this thing and then move there and hide. But it's not necessary. The DM can just say, yeah, you have sufficient cover to find something to hide behind. Take your attack and then, make your bonus action hide. The DM does not have to specify exact positioning and should not if they're using theater of the mind. Now, if that's too big a challenge for a DM, if the DM's like, no, I just don't want to fight. My players are used to battle maps and I just don't want to fight them. That's a fine decision to make. That you don't want your game to be a hostile situation where you are trying to foist something onto the players that they don't want. Like I said, in the previous episode, the game is supposed to be a collaborative effort. And if the players don't want to use a collaborative story building methodology, if they prefer a board game style in those critical situations, I don't necessarily think that the DM is wrong in employing that in those situations. I would hope as a player that DMs will at least try begin the transition away from that if I'm going to be playing with them over the long term, because collaborative story building and theater of the mind are so much more enjoyable as a player and a DM. And so in particular, right, as a DM, using theater of the mind dramatically cuts down on prep time. Right? You don't have to prepare maps. You don't have to collect miniatures. You don't have to make sure that players have their miniatures. Right? Everything exists in the imagination. Many players will want artwork associated with their character, and that's much easier to do when you're using theater of the mind, as opposed to trying to go out to Hero Forge and having a custom miniature made and then painted to represent that character accurately on a battle map. Like as I've already noted, the flow of the game is much better. It is much less board gamey when you have players describing narratively, this is what my character is going to do. It it also enables them to do things creatively that that is foreclosed when you have a very detailed board game situation, right? Like they can improvise actions, and that when you tried to translate it onto the rules of a battle map would not be possible. There is one area that comes up when we talk about game flow and resistant players, and that is spellcasters with areas of effect. This is, in my experience, the most problematic type. That spellcasters are used to being able to look at a battle map and precisely lay down an area of effect to do the optimum level. And in Theater of the Mind, and this is part of the DMG in 5th edition, you don't do that, right? You say, okay, you're laying out a area of effect of a certain size. It's going to affect a certain number of opponents, and the DM has and the player don't. That's just the way those rules work. The DM can narrate that, and the DM can decide on exceptions. Maybe this area is much open and the approach of the opponents was much wider, so that they can't get as many, or maybe the approach was more constrained, so that the player can get more. But the resistance occurs when player spellcasters want a precise location to try and optimize their spell effects, and that is probably the hardest thing to deal with as a DM transitioning to Theater of the Mind. But it does get easier, and if the DM is consistent and exercises both flexibility and discipline, I have found it to be not. It is a problem that one gets past pretty quickly. And then, similar to the flow, there is the matter of player agency. Because you don't have the constraints of the rules and the hard visuals of a board and miniatures, players are much freer to use their imagination and to construct more open narratives to accomplish the thing that they're wanting to do. Even if it's just a matter of description, right, of how they attack or how they find a place to hide. It's still a much more empowering position for players than having to have them focus solely on a miniature on a battle map. And then, like I said, once one is fluent with Theater of the Mind, the outcomes are much different. You have a much smoother gameplay as far as constructing a narrative, and you don't have the interruptions associated with putting miniatures on a battle map. It's just a much more smooth narrative, and I find it's worth it. I still use, whenever I am playtesting things that I develop, I still use battle maps a lot, particularly in the online game, because if one is developing material for others to use, one needs to be cognizant of the fact that there are going to be a lot of people who are using battle maps and miniatures, and you need to make sure that the material you're preparing is suited for that type of thing. Whenever in 2015, whenever I was first developing my material from my game for 5th edition, I didn't even include maps of the action, which was universally a criticism from reviewers. It's like, there's no maps here. I was like, no, you don't need a map. You just describe what's happening. I never use a map when I'm DMing. But I've come to realize that is not the case for even the majority of games. The majority of games do use maps. They do, despite the fact that I think that it is the lesser alternative to Theater of the Mind. I do recognize that it's a valid choice and a choice that is made by many. So anyway, I don't know if you find this useful, or if you just see it as a distracting screed. I don't know, but if it is useful, I hope you will like and subscribe. And I will try to get up the next video, which I think is going to be. I'm going to address some of the more common high-level gameplay decisions that DMs make that are problematic to their game. Things like the frequency of initiative, and the frequency of surprise, and those things that I have noticed that cause problems with games. And I hope to have that up in a few days. So thank you for tuning in.